Okay, hello all, and welcome to the first episode of Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. This is a podcast dedicated to colubrids and snakes that are like colubrids, and we're going to get into this in a minute. Colubroids. They don't have much love on the podcast or in the podcast universe, and my co-host Matt Most and I decided that they needed it, and we're here to give it to them. So I'm Zach Loafman. More on me in a minute, but my co-host here is Matt Most. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. And yourself?
I'm doing great. So this is weird, but we're going to give it a go. So, yeah. So the $1 million question, Matt, is why are we doing this? Why a podcast on colubrids?
Well, I think you talked me into this, didn't you?
Yeah,
said,
I
"Hey,
did
Matt,
actually do that.
Get a phone call Saturday. Hey, Matt, what are you doing on Friday night? Nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are. No, in all honesty, though, I mean, as we explore different changes in not only our hobby, but also in the realm of herpetology, I think this is a group that's been underexplored, and especially in the hobby has been getting a lot more interest. And one of the things, obviously, is to make sure that we're presenting information in a positive way so that new keepers as well as experienced keepers can gain from those experiences of other keepers. Obviously, as we procure information, YouTube has been kind of the sensational aspect, and unfortunately there's a lot of garbage out there.
Yes, lots of garbage. And
Well,
we're hoping to alleviate that a little bit with this, I guess.
Trying to, right?
Yes, at least we're trying to. We're going to give it a good go.
But presenting information in a positive way, I think, is the best way to procure information towards the hobby as well as advance our hobby more, as it seems as though since mid 80s, early 90s, when a number of these species were prolific in the hobby and then kind of dwindled away, we've lost a lot of the aspects of keeping as well as experience of setting up a scientific experiment in our own room and homes as well, and learning about how to justify as well as advance the actual keeping skills of species that are commonly kept, but also advancing some of the skill sets of our keepers.
Yeah. And as far as the podcast universe is concerned, reptile podcasts have proliferated exponentially, it seems, in the past year or two. And with the Morelia Python radio network, I listen to those all the time. I spend a lot of time in the car driving from point A to point B. I know you do too. And I feel like I know far more about Morelia and Antaresia and all these different Python genera because I've got Morelia Python radio. And I oftentimes found myself wishing and hoping that there would be that same kind of format for a podcast that would cover the snakes that I absolutely love, which are colubrids. And it just kind of got to a point where I realized, quit bitching about it in your mind and just grab the bull by the horns and do it yourself. So when I kind of came up with the idea of maybe doing this, I talked with Eric, I talked with Lucas, who's my grad student and part of the network, and was like, "You think we could do this?" And they both were all about it. And the first person I thought of when it came to somebody else was you, because we share similar interests. We've got a lot of breadth between us. You have far more keeping experience than I do, but at the same time, we both like our oddballs, but we both have corn snakes. So,
Right.
It's kind of I think that this is a very natural fit for the simple fact that our approaches to maintaining these animals are similar but different. And one of the cool things about us is that we're open-minded, and we have science backgrounds, and we'll get into that here in a minute. And when you're raised in the scientific universe, you're taught to remain objective, and you don't obliterate someone's idea right off the bat just because you don't like it. You wait for the evidence to come in to basically say yay or nay as to whether you're going to adopt a given aspect of care into your keeping strategy. And that's something that we're both really big on. And this podcast, we hope it's going to be a vessel for evidence-based herpetoculture, which is something that we both, strive to do. So what the ultimate format of this, if you're wondering, what's this going to be like? I I'm not bowing to the Podfather and Eric and Owen, but at the same time, I've been listening to their podcast for literally ever, and I just love the format of NPR. And so if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So we're essentially going to do the exact same thing with this one, where we're even going to steal the same questions. I asked Eric for outlines, and the outline we have tonight it is a direct result of an outline that he gave us from one of their episodes. So it's going to be the long format, 90 minutes, 2 hours, something in there. And we're going to basically bring on breeders. We're going to have questions that the two of us are going to discuss. We're also going to have some herpetology for the sake of herpetology. We both have backgrounds in that. And we hope to make this a fun, interactive place for Colubrid nerds to go to, because we just don't have a place to go in this particular universe. So hopefully we're going to make that place with this. So with that being said, do you have anything you'd like to add to the intro before we jump in, or kind of introduce to the audience so that they know your perspective on things, or did we cover it, or where are we on that?
I think you pretty much covered it all here, Zach. I think one of the biggest things is just keeping an open mind as we go through this and make sure that ideas are obviously presented in the scientific format of presenting an idea, testing that out, and then coming up with those conclusions based upon that hypothesis that's been proposed. I think that's something that's often the generalized aspect of this hobby. Sometimes we lend ourselves to believing that a care sheet is the best way to roll with. And for a number of animals, we're really not advancing the species, but rather we're sustaining that. And I think we're going to get into that a lot in this realm of colubrids too as well, and explore that too as well, because there's a lot of information that is missing.
Yes, absolutely. And you hear a lot of people complain and for lack of a better word, bitch about care sheets, but then you don't oftentimes hear an alternative proposed, or an outline of approach proposed for people that are reliant on care sheets. And that's one of the things that we hope to do with this, is kind of dig into details and just really kind of, when we have a guest on and they are the keeper or the breeder of a weird, obscure colubrid or king snakes, corn snakes, those kind of nitty gritty little details are what we're all about with this. Because once you get that information and you have it in your toolbox, that serves as that evidence to basically shoot your husbandry methodology into the future. And one of the things you're not going to hear here is, well, I've always done it that way, so that's the way I'm going to do it. Because at any point in time, you can learn something new. And when you learn that new little nugget, if you're willing to adapt, you're keeping maybe better. You might end up getting more eggs. You might not lose as many neonates if you learn some new technique and you're willing to change the way you do things. So that's what we're all about here. And yeah, so that's basically our introduction to our introduction. So now I'd like to address one aspect of this, which is, first and foremost, why or how did you get into reptiles? We're already bucking the outline here.
Yeah,
but I think it's good for us to kind of get into our backgrounds before we get into some science and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. So I was raised in a suburb of Chicago, and during the time, there was a lot of new animals coming in, both from Madagascar, Africa, and as any child, we all explore the aspect of dinosaurs. We enjoy going to museums, zoos, and being in that realm of Chicago itself lended itself to a lot of scientific beauty and joy, because you had natural history museum, science industry. You had both Brookfield as well as Lincoln Park Zoo, and we used to go to the museums and explore that. And I think, like many people in this hobby, were attracted not only to reptiles initially, but to dinosaurs.
Yes.
And then we look at the evolutionary development of these reptilia and how they're actually transformed into that. And at the same point in time, you started to see a lot of things being brought into the hobby. Philippe de Vosgio writing the white pamphlets of care.
I love
for
those.
a number. But that's when we started to really explode, from my perspective, the herpetocultural aspect of this hobby. But bringing it even more forefront was growing up in an area where a lot of pet stores were developing, but at that same point in time, probably one of the, well, not the first, but one of the more mainstream in the Chicagoland area was Chicago Reptile House.
Nice.
And obviously at that point, I mean, you saw so much stuff coming in from Madagascar. You saw huge monitor lizards, a lot of stuff that we don't see anymore in that type of aspect. And being in a close vicinity to Chicago Reptile House um, was always an adventure. Not only because you had to get feeders if you had some sort of reptile or amphibian, but my grandmother, I grew up in a single family home, and my grandmother lived with us, and she always procured the aspect of, if you want to take care of something responsibly, you need to read and educate yourself accordingly. And in that aspect, before I would actually purchase any sort of animal or setup, I actually built up quite the library of Philippe's
Hmm.
documentation, as well as some of the first eco books, too, as well, that were published at that same time. And learning about the animals and looking back at some of those things, you start to even question some of the new keeping skills and old keeping skills of how
Hmm.
things were done. Obviously technology has changed drastically. I mean, we're looking at new developments in lighting, heating, and some of those things we didn't have that at that point in time. You had
Yeah.
regular heat bulbs that were used for dome lighting
Hmm.
in painting situations. But that was kind of the pinnacle aspect of the reading, learning about the animals. I mean, even on weekends, at that point in time, my uncle lived very close too, and we would dissect frogs on a Saturday outside to learn about anatomy. So it was bringing everything more full circle too, as well, because my interests and really kind of the realm of graduate school for myself was actually biomechanics. And
Oh,
it kind
cool.
of brought everything full circle because there was so many interesting aspects of keeping animals, like how is a chameleon able to shoot their tongue out, how are they able to capture prey. There was just a lot of questions, and it brought those questions to full circle in learning about the natural history of the animal. Because at that point in time, I wasn't interested in breeding the animals, I was
Yep.
more interested in collecting, learning, um, trying to advance my hobby skill set. Because at that point in time, bearded dragons were $1,000 a piece.
Yeah,
You
that's
weren't
insane.
really, especially when you
Hmm.
think about it, because they're probably one of the highest number of animals bred worldwide,
Oh,
just
without
in
question.
bulk.
Yeah.
And even, and I feel bad for a lot of the younger keepers now, because I'm sure you remember getting Glades Herp
Yeah.
wholesale price list in the mail, and you'd be like,
Hmm.
"Wow, you can get tree frogs from Africa,
Hmm.
South America, all that stuff." Um, and every month you'd be waiting for that price list to come in the mail or look at, and even hearing some of the stories, specifically from what I would consider veteran keepers in the hobby now. Even hearing about some of the old shows, they're not like what the reptile shows are
No,
today.
they're definitely not like. Yeah.
you know I mean, I would love to go back in time and go to like one of the shows where they had it at a hotel, and they got monkey tail skinks hanging off the window,
Yeah, that's insane.
or pulling
No.
open dresser drawers, and new species being discovered and identified, and nothing available on
Hmm.
it. But even in terms of that, a lot of information wasn't around, so it was really about exploring the not only natural history of the animal, but also geographically learning about those
Hmm.
areas. And that brought in a lot of context too, as well, in terms of learning about cultures, learning about a number of things that really kind of brought it full circle too.
Yep. No, I had a similar background. I was an epic dinosaur nerd. Uh,
Yep.
Absolutely huge. My museum. So I grew up in the northern panhandle of West Virginia, which is that itty bitty little bit of West by God that's sandwiched between Ohio and Pennsylvania. And the closest big city to me is Pittsburgh. So my museum that I went to and literally was my birthday present from my parents for at least I don't know, 5 or 6 birthdays was we would go up to Carnegie Museum of Natural History and see the dinosaurs there. And, nerdy shout out to Carnegie. They have the type specimen of Tyrannosaurus Rex. So I got to, see that when I was 5 through 10, and it absolutely made my, little universe. Anyway, but my background with keeping is kind of interesting. I had a grandfather that was notorious for showing up with coffee cans in the late 80s and early 90s that would have some random creature in them. And we had praying mantises, pickerel frogs, things like that. But the first herp that I kept was a box turtle that my grandfather plucked off of the road in Ohio. Obviously, we'd only be doing that now, but back in the day, things were different. And we came up with the original name of Boxy, the box turtle. But I kept Boxy for, I think, about a year or two. And Boxy then elevated to anoles. And I made the switch from dinosaurs to reptiles in 3rd grade. I actually remember when I did it because I was sick and tired of just reading about the dinosaurs all the time. I wanted to actually focus on something I could go and find or see. And you could see the lizards. So I did a hard, stage left to the lizards, and basically natural history has been my game. It was my game before I knew natural history was a thing. And so I went to college where I teach. At that time, it was West Liberty State College. Now it's West Liberty University. And I got my undergrad there, had a wonderful advisor who was a snake guy, Mr. Gordon. And, the first copperhead that I caught, I collected it, and it lived in his living room until it dropped babies. And then we let the mom and the babies go, and we kept one of them, which ultimately became the only venomous snake that, well, I've kept 2. One of 2 venomous snakes that I had, but I didn't really get into herpetoculture until I was in college. My mother would not let me have a snake. The infamous bit of Loafman family lore is that when I was getting ready to graduate high school, Mom said, I will either get you a Jeep Wrangler or a snake. And I said, well, I'm definitely taking the snake. I kind of knew she was bluffing, but at the same time, there was like no hesitation. And my first snake was the obligatory corn snake. Mine wasn't a little worm. It was an adult. So my initiation into legit herpetoculture, the way I like to think about it, in the late 90s was with that corn snake. And the herp show that I always used to go to was the All Ohio Reptile Show in Columbus. It was a monthly show. It was one of the first. In fact, I think it was the first rotating monthly show or something of that ilk. And like you said, I remember going to that show the first time, and my mind it wasn't blown, it was obliterated, because I saw all these animals that I had read about in books, and I was seeing things that like I held zoos in high regard until I went to that show. And the first Matamata I saw, I was just like, oh my God, is that thing real? I've seen these my entire life in books, and here it is. And so through college, I had all manner of things. And at that point in time, it was absolutely keeping. It wasn't breeding. And then I went on and I decided that I was going to pursue natural history as a career. So I went and did graduate school. My first semester was at Florida Tech in Melbourne. And I just got married, and my wife and I moved down to Florida, and we lasted 1 semester. It turns out that hillbillies like me don't do well in that flat open space that's known as Florida. But culturally, it wasn't a good fit, but biologically, it was amazing. And I think I herped every other night, road cruising, doing all that kind of stuff. And I knew the fit wasn't good for me, so I bounced, and I ended up getting my master's degree in a herpetology lab at Marshall University. And as you'll soon learn, or you'll hear about in future episodes, my thesis was supposed to be on eastern hognose snakes in West Virginia, and I truly got humbled. They kicked my ass. The other graduate students and I put in over 1,000 hours before we found one, and that doesn't, you can't get a degree studying one individual snake, even though I still consider that to be the best snake I've ever found. But ultimately, I got my master's degree, and I studied how reptiles and amphibians move into mine lands when we're done taking coal out of the mountains. And it was kind of an interesting venture for me. Turns out, like, snakes, I don't want to say they benefit from it, but they definitely move into the disturbed habitats because they can bask. But things like box turtles, they would get caught out in the open and actually cook on the surface of the mine. It was kind of crazy. But anywho, then I bounced from graduate school. My wife and I decided we were going to come home, so we came back to Wheeling, where we live currently. And I was teaching at the nature center that I worked in immediately after high school with my fancy graduate degree. And then West Liberty called and said, "Hey, do you want a job here?" And I said, "Yes, please," and jumped all over that. And at first I wasn't going to get my doc. And then I was told, basically, get the doctorate or you're fired in 2 years. So by that point, I had made a transition to crawdads. And, that's what I study now. The herpetology job market was saturated. Nobody studies crawdads. If you're sitting there thinking he studies crawdads, yeah, there's a reason, because you're thinking that. And since, I did that, it's kind of the whole big fish, small pond thing, and it worked out really well. And I ended up getting my doc with that. And then in 2016 is when my life changed. Actually, technically 2015, we hired a guy named Dr. Joe Greathouse, who came in and said, "Hey, let's start this zoo science major." I was like, "What the hell is a zoo science major?" And it turns out there's a major that prepares people to work in a zoo. And I was all about it. We've got a zoo. I worked in it in college, right down the road, less than 10 minutes away. So there were only a handful of these programs across the country. When you're a small school, you're always looking for a niche. And so we put together that major, and he was supposed to run it. And then he did such a good job that they offered him the directorship of the damn zoo. So when you do that, it's kind of like, well, crap, who's going to run this? And everybody kind of turned and was like, "You're going to do it, Zach." So I got thrust back into the world of animal husbandry, and my only comfort zone was herpetoculture. And I basically told everybody, if I'm going to be running the major boots on the ground guy at the university, and we're going to have an animal collection, it's going to be herps. And I got no resistance. So then I ended up getting the dream job that like every herp keeper dreams of, which is they basically, like, my university said, "All right, build an animal collection." So I've been doing that basically for the past 5 years. And now fast forward, we have a graduate program. I've got graduate students doing herpetoculture research for their thesis degree. I'm currently building, or I'm not building, but our wonderful maintenance peeps are building a gigantic water monitor enclosure across the hallway from me. And we have over 200 individual herps, excluding babies. If you throw in the neonates we have had hatch this year, I think we're somewhere between 350 and 500 reptiles are in this building right now with me. So it's been quite the ride. I enjoyed the ride. But when you do this job, you end up with this thing called imposter syndrome. And I didn't really have imposter syndrome. I was just trying to infiltrate the zoo world, and you got to get street cred. So the way I got street cred is I just started writing, and I put out a couple articles, and I'm writing a book right now, which we'll talk about later. And yeah, I've absolutely loved being thrown back into herpetology and herpetoculture again. I wasn't expecting it, but I'm glad it happened. So that's kind of how I got to where I am. And that was my introduction to podcasts, because there was nothing, the level of detail I was looking for to create classes that I teach and this stuff, I couldn't find it in written word. And so I started listening to Morelia Python Radio, the Herpetoculture podcast, Animals at Home, all the different podcasts that are out there, and found out that this was a beautiful vehicle for getting information at the level that I wanted it. So that was a massive inspiration for why you and I are doing this right now, is to just basically do this for the Colubrids.
Well, and for a lot of those that are in high school or even looking at pursuing a career in this realm, not only from a keeping side, but also studying herps or going into ichthyology, I think a lot of people don't understand how hard it is now to work with live animals at a higher education standpoint, especially having gone through it just like yourself. I mean, we're kind of hindered in some aspects because we're not doing things with mice or rats.
Yes.
And looking at that sort of vertebrate for different scientific research. So usually when we're at a university level, it's like, well, this guy wants to bring in snakes, or this guy wants to work with lizards. But not only that, I think it might even be important from your perspective, even for those interested, to maybe even identify like how hard it is to work with iacox and stuff like that for live animal research.
Yeah, people think that you can just pick up the snakes if you're out of college and start studying them, but like all things, there's a bureaucracy and hoops you got to jump through. And the good thing about my university is that we absolutely do that because it's a necessary evil. It makes sure that you're not harming or hurting the animals, and it kind of covers your butt in case anybody were to come after you. But my school's been really good about attempting to streamline that and not let it get in the way of actually getting things accomplished, but at the same time kind of keeping everybody honest. But at bigger schools, oh my gosh, it's absolutely insane. So
Yeah,
I'm
because when
gonna
I remember doing my master's at Loyola, and I almost wasn't able to finish it
mhm.
because there was always questions about what was going on.
Yeah, it's a nutty world. Bureaucracy kills productivity. But we're not going to go down that rant because I could
No,
go for
no,
about
no.
5 hours on that one.
Yeah.
So
No, I just think it's interesting because a lot of people would think, well, I can just go to school and study this,
mhm.
where there's
Yes,
a lot more stuff that goes into it.
yeah, absolutely. Uh, so that's kind of our backgrounds. So one of the things I'd like to talk about right now is the name of the podcast, because it's Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. And there's a reason why we're using that word Colubroid. There's a good chance some people are like, what the hell is a Colubroid? Well, I teach 2 herpetology classes, and I have to do things on the level, and we have to make sure we're teaching the students the correct thing. And the reality of it is, when we say the word colubrid, there's this kind of perspective that is basically any snake that is not a boa, a python, um, elephant trunk snakes, or worm snakes, things like that, and then a whole bunch of really kind of weird, obscure things. And there, or it's not a fixed front fang snake, something like a cobra, mamba, crate, viper, rattlesnake, whatever. But the reality of this is that the family Colubridae, as it's historically been known, was this kind of dumpster fire of taxonomy. Basically, if you weren't any of those snakes that we just discussed, you were thrown into this family Colubridae up until about a decade ago. And what many people don't realize is that a decade ago, what was historically referred to as the Colubroid, there were some really massive papers that just haven't kind of infiltrated herpetoculture for some odd reason. And the scientists that were doing this work were trying to infiltrate and add reason to all these kind of typical snakes, the so-called colubrids. And what they ultimately ended up finding, depending on whether you're what we call a lumper, which is basically you're very conservative taxonomically, or you're a splitter, which means you're willing to accept change more readily. That's the way I like to describe splitters, because I might be one myself, is that it became very apparent that what we call a colubrid is really just limited to the rat snakes, the milk snakes, the pine snakes, crebos, racers, whip snakes in North America, and then things like kukri snakes in Asia, wolf snakes, things like that. And that all these other animals are actually members of their own family. So when we talk about garter snakes, water snakes, keelbacks, those are all now, people use the word natricid in the hobby, but what I don't think they know what that means necessarily. All of us, some people absolutely do. But anytime you add the suffix id to a word, you're basically implying that is a family of snakes. So the Colubridae is a family of snakes, and garter snakes, water snakes, keelbacks, they're all natricids, which is the natricidae. So, and things like hognose snakes. Everybody talks about hognose snakes as a type of colubrid. They're not a colubrid. They're in their own unique family, totally different from Colubridae, massively different evolutionarily. They're in this family we call the Dipsadidae, if you are a splitter and adopt that taxonomy. So the proper terminology for these other families is you would add the suffix oid to the word, because oid just simply means to take the shape of. And we're going to go with that. There's another way taxonomically. We're not going to go down that path because everybody's going to be bored to death. But basically, the suffix oid means the form of a colubrid. And using the word colubroid, you can totally say garter snakes, water snakes, keelbacks are colubroids because they have the same basic body plan of a corn snake, kinda. Things like hognose snakes, false water cobras, Musaranas, Barons racers. Those are all those Dipsadids, Dipsadidae, family Dipsadidae, but they're Colubroids because they have that body plan of a Colubrid. So we decided to make our title scientifically accurate. I couldn't just go with Colubrid Radio. You couldn't either. So we came up with Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. And, you know, our whole goal here is to teach. So with that being said, we can't, sorry. It's a hill, a nerdy hill I'm going to die on, but we're going to go with the word Colubroid because every time I see people talk about my favorite Colubrid is a hognose snake, I don't understand why, but a little part of me dies. Like, just, I die in that moment. I'm long dead resulting of that. So anyway, so that's the reason or justification behind our name. And, you know, you can always educate people. And when we say educate, that's not like correcting in a bad way. Don't walk up to whoever and be like, you're saying it wrong, blah. That's not what we're saying. We're just simply throwing it out there into the ether so that people can pick that up and adopt it. Because one of the issues that herpetoculture has, and I know this, you know, being in the universe that I dwell in, is that every now and then we do have a credibility issue, and people are you know, people move in, regulations pop up, and if you're able to talk to that person that's making the regs in an educated way, you're going to make an impact because then they're going to realize, oh, you know, this isn't some crazy guy with 15 gaboon vipers, you know, living in his garage. Not that there's anything wrong with that if that happens to be you, but be careful. But you know, this person actually understands it, and the people that are making those decisions, a lot of them are the people that I work with, being a conservation biologist, and I know I'm able to make inroads with people here in my state because I know what I'm talking about. So that's just something that can kind of help all of us, is if we actually kind of adopt and try to utilize the science in a way and not just blow it off. Because if you do that, you're not really doing yourself any favors.
No, and that's something you and we've even talked about
Mm-hmm.
because as we advance in this hobby, as well as in the scientific methods, we're going to find a lot more about
Oh,
a number
absolutely.
of these families.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at it not only from morphology, but also from a genetic aspect. And a lot of things are going to change as
Mm-hmm.
long as there's
Absolutely.
scientific backing for a number
Yes.
of these aspects. And
But
that's sometimes the hard part.
oh yeah, that's the hard part, and it. And I'm not saying that everybody has to go start reading journal articles because you can't, or so you can, but like you don't need to. That'll put many of you, including myself, to sleep. I've been doing it all summer long, and today was a struggle getting through the papers I was reading. But at the same time, yeah, don't let it intimidate you. You can do it, but it is what it is. So that's kind of my stance on that, and we're gonna do everything we can to throw out fun facts and new information to people from the world of herpetology and the world of herpetoculture. And herpetoculture has a lot of good to do for the science of herpetology. A lot of these animals, especially obscure colubrids, which seem to be making a bit of a comeback right now, which is pretty awesome. We don't know anything about their biology. When you read about the life history biology of many different snake species, they basically have a name and people have described them, but we don't know how many babies they have. We don't know if they, for some taxa, we don't even know if they lay eggs or have live birth. I mean, that seems very straightforward. We don't have that information. And, you know, I'm going to totally give, you know, pat Matt on the back here because you've got your, is it the red striped snakes, the African guys?
Mm-hmm.
Am I right?
The red stripe. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Which you brought in, and you want to talk about what you did with that because that's pretty
Well, and even,
phenomenal.
even talking about that even too in general is, I mean, you look at Messenger's book,
Yes.
even talking with Messenger and working with Kevin on it, as he even noted, a lot of that information from the captive husbandry side isn't noted.
Yeah,
You
it's
won't
totally
find
not
that
noted.
in journal articles. You won't find that anywhere.
Mm-mm.
And that's one of the more interesting aspects, I think, from the herpetocultural side and scientific realm is you do see that balance and that necessary working together to actually
Mm-hmm.
fit that information. But I mean, working with those red and black, I mean, a lot of people think of Africa as, you know, 88 to 90 degrees, very
Mm-hmm.
hot area. But I don't think a lot of people will actually take the time to look at Africa and then realize that there are different aspects of temperature gradient, rainforests, savannas, and you are going to see different temperature changes throughout a number of those areas, as well as looking at the watching an animal, setting them up properly, and monitoring and adjusting accordingly to watching that specific animal. Because a lot of things can actually change drastically by, creating an experiment like that where there is
Hmm.
no information. But one of the things that we've faltered in some aspects in this hobby is, like you mentioned, I mean, care sheets are good for some stuff, but for a lot of things, you have to watch the animal.
Yes.
That's why for a number of things, I'll set animals up not only in racks, but also in cages. And that's a topic I know we'll probably bring up and
Hmm.
discuss throughout this because there are benefits to both sides of it, but more so monitoring animal and adjusting accordingly because we don't have that information. Even researching and Zach, obviously you know too as well with trying to publish some natural history notes on that species. Um, I mean, just recently in a review on something that I wrote, I was asked, "Have I done a full literature search?" And the response I had was, "Yep," and it's all field herp surveys.
Yeah.
So there is no information. And even from field herp surveys, I don't think a lot of people would think or guess that there is nothing related to temperature, humidity, foliage in area, diet. None of that information is available. It's basically no, we dug up and put buckets in the ground to see
Hmm.
what fell in the bucket. We put drift fences out to see what we could capture. And so we are missing a lot of pieces of husbandry as well as number of clutch sizes a year, number of eggs in a clutch. And by having some of those animals in the hobby actually helps to educate not only from a hobbyist standpoint, but for the natural history of that species.
Yep.
And you're going to lose a lot of animals doing that, which is unfortunate, but is the truth. So if you are procuring or proceeding with a very rare species in this hobby, it is something that you are going to play a numbers game,
Hmm.
especially when that information isn't available, because you may actually have to set up animals in different temperature zones and adjust accordingly for that.
Yeah.
Because I think most of the people that actually purchase those animals, they lost a lot of them. I can say that even from my standpoint because I lost a lot of them. And even in that keeping of those animals, sometimes we forget that a wild caught animal is going to have parasites, and in some reasons, you may need to treat them appropriately. Other times, an animal, if the stress level is doable or something where the animal isn't dehydrated going downhill, they can naturally live with some of those parasites and do well. But working with that specific species and bringing them to veterinarian care, came to find out that there was a new type of parasite that had
Oh
no
my goodness.
antibiotics for it,
Hmm.
and they weren't treatable. And this is actually something that is actually a big issue right now and is actually going through some snake farms in Florida where it's actually killing off entire collections due to a parasite that actually is transmitted not only through the fecal matter itself of the animal, but when you think about it, that animal would then potentially be further infected because we're not keeping them in a sterile environment or anything of that nature. And sometimes husbandry falters in that way. But it's not just the means of water or defecation in there, but the parasite can actually go through the epidermis or skin of the actual animal and continue to reinfect it. So a lot
Mm.
of that information, not only from the natural history of them, but now we're learning more about parasites too,
Hmm.
and how can we actually grow and learn more from that, and even sending samples and providing specimens to a parasitologist at Purdue. They were able to advance some of that and look at things that can actually kill that parasite, because at the end of the day, it's going to help everyone
Yeah.
at the standpoint. And even from that, you start to not only test your keeping skills, but also your biological protection protocol for your other aspects of collection. Something you and we've talked about a
Mm-hmm.
ton, because in this hobby, I think a lot of people forget about important aspects of cleanliness and quarantining, proper water, diet, because you can lose your collection overnight if you don't follow strict protocols, especially if you have a large collection.
Yeah, if you have a large collection and you're not using quarantine and quality control and QA/QC or whatever you want to call it procedures, you're just you are looking down the inevitable barrel of a hypothetical gun. Something will inevitably pop up at some point. Nobody's safe. A lot of people know me because I've been on podcasts talking about crypto, and crypto is definitely something we will talk about at a later point in time, dedicated episode, because Cryptosporidium uh, serpentis is a parasite that is particularly lethal to colubrids, and unfortunately, I got to experience that. And this here at the university, and the species that it wiped out first were corn snakes. And if you think of all the people that have corn snakes, that's a beginner snake. Um, so it wasn't some far off tropical crazy imported animal. This was an example of a parasite that was brought into the collection from one of the students and unintentionally, obviously, transmitted to one of our corns. And the next thing you know, we lost a bunch of colubrids. Happy to say that we have completely contained that, and we've been multiple years now without crypto. But that gets back to the kind of care that we're going to be promoting here, which is we just want to throw stuff out into the ether for you all, and enable you to kind of elevate your husbandry, because that's what we're all about. So, okay, well, we got some questions here for each other. So,
and moving on to a lighter subject.
yes, let's get away from the gloom and doom and just kind of get into some fun stuff. So, I'm going to ask the first question, which is, I'm looking at the outline and it's one of your questions. So we're scrapping the outline. We're just going to ask the damn question. So this is a fun one because there's as a herpetoculturalist, we can keep turtles, lizards. You get into lizards, you got geckos, skinks, monitors, iguanas, lacertilids, all kinds of things. And so when you hop over to snakes, obviously there's pythons, boids, and then the colubrids and colubroids. So my question to you is, it's twofold, and then you'll return it back to me, which is, do you keep anything currently that's not a colubrid, and what is it? And then, I know the bulk of your collection's colubrids. Why colubrids? Like, of all the freaking snakes that we could have, I mean, there's podcast after podcast about pythons. Nothing against that, but why didn't you head towards the big old boids? What about the little worms of the world, the colubrids and the colubroids? Strikes your fancy?
Yeah, definitely. Well, obviously there's a number of different things crawling around here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I do have some doomro boas.
Mm-hmm.
I do have some white lip pythons.
Nice.
Yeah, so the reason why for some of those different species that I went down the path of that is actually because I don't see a lot of them being produced anymore.
Mm-hmm.
White lips, Stan Grumbeck, my friend down
Yeah.
in Texas, he kind of talked me into working with some. So we split up some animals in both collections. And part of it was the fact that we don't see them anymore in the hobby.
Yeah.
And eventually, and this is something that we're seeing already as a result of COVID, is the number of imported animals has drastically decreased,
Mm-hmm.
which is part of the reason why we're seeing such a scurry in the purchasing and sale of a number of species. And also, I think what's fueling some of these prices right now is just
Yeah.
the availability of animals. That being said, I would never bring an animal here if I wasn't interested in the animal.
Yep.
A lot of people falter from my perspective, and I see it in a number of emails that I get, because a lot of people will chase the monetary realm
Mm-hmm.
of this hobby. I wouldn't pursue the hobby for that reason, because things change, things go in fads, and if you're not happy with an animal, you shouldn't pursue it, you shouldn't procure it. You really should just let it to someone else that's going to be very interested in it, because we are going to see different waves. Right now, part of the aspect we're seeing in the hobby, and another big portion of procuring this, proceeding with this podcast, is we're seeing a huge interest in colubrids,
Yes.
and it's obviously a direct result of the fact that they've disappeared from the hobby. Even corn snakes. We're seeing a lot of corn snakes no longer available. I do keep corn snakes here. A lot of that is actually Maggie's project. I thought it would be a
Nice.
cool way of introducing an 8-year-old to genetics
Mm-hmm.
and trying to show how different um, aspects can actually influence the phenotype of an animal, and how does that actually transfer through breeding. And looking at Punnett squares and trying to do that with an
Mm-hmm.
8-year-old is a little over an 8-year-old's head at this point
Mm-hmm.
in time, but it brings an interest to it. The big realm of keeping colubrids in general, um, and other animals in general, is size.
Okay.
I've always kept with a size differential because big animal
Hmm.
means a lot of time. And with my job, I travel for work, and it can sometimes be a challenge in terms of maintenance with those aspects. I've primarily focused off on the Asian rat snakes, obviously,
Yeah.
and a lot of that I had to do with their natural history, a lot of information not being available. And I think that was very interesting to work with Kevin on and learn even more from my sake. But the natural color of those
Mm-hmm.
animals is just outstanding. And I think we're going to
Yeah.
learn a lot more. Obviously, Zach, we're working on something there
Mm-hmm.
too. Um, I think we're going to learn a lot more about locality. I think we're going to learn a lot more in terms of how animals are identified. And that to me is very interesting because
Yes.
there's a lot of unknown. And that's what actually fuels my passion for a number of those different colubrids, especially Asiatic animals, is there's a lot of things that haven't even been explored anatomically on a
Mm-hmm.
number of those species. Some things may never be explored. Some things may never be explained in the way that we think. Um, but from my background, like I was saying, I mean, my educational aspect was biomechanics. So I was always interested in how things worked and functioned in a means to um, reiterate why animals are doing that. And that's what I've explored. And that is a big portion of why I keep a number of colubrids, not only off of size, but the natural history of the animal, the color of the animal. Um, Now, that being taken into account, I did keep David's rat snakes here, and they're a brown
Yep.
snake,
But
but
they're a pretty badass brown snake.
they are.
Mm-hmm.
I remember even procuring those, and the offering group was an adult male and 2 hatchling females.
Oh my goodness.
And when you talk about working with people on collaborative projects, and I'm sure this will come up in our discussions with other people as we bring more people
Mm-hmm.
on, but working with people on projects can sometimes be extremely challenging because sometimes people forget the nature of why we're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we have to make those unfortunate phone calls of death
Yeah.
or things of that nature. And for some of those new species in the hobby, they're not cheap.
No.
So I remember calling Stan probably like a month into having that group, and the adult male died. Now you're stuck with 2 hatchling females,
Uh,
you know. But like Stan always said, we'll work our way through it. But it was always very interesting to not only on colubrids themselves, but like white lips, trying new things, exploring new aspects because they're not readily bred in captivity. Loxosimus are
yeah.
another species that I have here, the Mexican burrowing python, and those were actually gifted to me by Stan too as well, just to try to increase not only the captive population, but to ensure that I had some at my house, he had some at his house, um, because if something ever happened to one person's collection, at least there was a backup
Yep.
in that sense.
No,
Um,
that's the smart way of doing it.
yeah, and that's the fun part. I mean, Clint and Clint Bartley from Bartley Reptiles, we've explored that. We work on a number of projects together too, and it's fun. I
Yeah.
think that's the cool part with doing stuff like that is you can enjoy and talk about your passion even further. Even some of the people that have just focused on ball pythons, right?
Hmm.
They're not necessarily interested in the natural history of the animal. Some people are very interested in the genetics of the animal, which is awesome. I mean, there's a lot of stuff
Yeah.
you can do, but for some keepers, if you asked them where they were found, not only in terms of geographical location, but where they actually live, they wouldn't be able to tell you.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of what's really pushed me one way or the other. Obviously, my background, I worked with a number of other things too. I mean, I worked with venomous while I was in grad school and did a lot of work with Bruce Young while I was at the University of Massachusetts. But when I came back to Indiana, I decided I would never work with venomous again.
Yeah.
uh, and it kind of went that route, but did pursue bear and
Mm.
which are extremely fast.
Hmm. Yes, they are. I got two of them right up there.
Yep.
So
But when we look at Colubrids and Colubrid, there's just so much questions, so
yes.
many questions that we can bring to that table, and things and that's what really brings me to those groups
Yeah.
is just it.
That's what brought me to them. I have and a lot of people that really know me know this about me, but I have a little bit of biology ADD. Like I thrive in diversity. That's what I like. And with the boids and the pythons, there's nothing wrong with them. In fact, I keep quite a few of them. Here in my office at work, I have a wall of poplin carpets or IJs, whatever you want to call them. I also have. I'm a big boa guy. I've always liked boas, and I like the locality and the kind of old taxonomy of boas. So I have short-tailed boas, which aren't recognized anymore taxonomically, but Amarilli. Uh,
I
and
didn't know you
then
had those.
yeah,
Yeah,
they're right over there. I'm raising up a pair of those.
yeah.
And my favorite of all the boids, which I have at my house, are yellow anacondas. I'm the only, I have an affinity for things that live in water. That is a common theme for me. I mean, crayfish live in water, for crying out loud. And there's really not a better water snake than an anaconda, but I'm not going down the green anaconda path. That's a little bit nuts. Uh, but I love my yellow annies. They're kind of, they're also fit the bill for me because I also like aggressive snakes. So, and they're not cuddly. We'll just leave it at that. And then I also have short-tailed pythons. So at my house, I have Bloods and Sumatrans. So it's not just colubrids for me, but they're definitely the bulk of my collection. And I love the oddballs. Those are definitely the species that I've always been kind of gravitate towards. So my collection is primarily um, com- made up of the dipsadids. That so much so I've become so infatuated with those snakes over the past 5 years. Like I started off sitting on my couch trying to figure out what we were going to get for zoo science, and then I wanted to have my own special little project that was mine that I could maybe do some husbandry work with or something. And that's where, of course, lots of people know me for my false water cobras, and they live in water. They're kind of the ultimate water snake. At the time, I thought, yeah, we're not going to go down that path. They're venomous. I've now subsequently learned they do have juvenoid secretions that are significant, but at the same time, they're not as bad as people made them out to be. And I basically got them, loved them. And then, well, if I like these, I probably would like tricolor hognose snakes. So I picked up those, which aren't related to North American hognose snakes, guys, but everybody thinks that they're like basically the same thing. They're distant. They're in the same family, but they're definitely not the same lineage. So, and that nerdy evolutionary history and natural history and biology, I like that. So it's really cool to have at my house a tricolor hog in my left hand and then a Western hog in my right hand, and know, this is convergent evolution right here. Like, and I get to see it and I get to interact with it. So my interest with the colubrids is definitely with the diversity, and it's with the fact that you can absolutely make little discoveries when you're working with them. Because a lot of these taxa just showed up in herpetoculture within the past decade. And we're just now figuring out how to breed them. And I love that part of it. So for me,
heck, for some of that, it's keeping it alive.
yeah, just freaking. Oh, I know all about that. I'm going down the path you went with the red stripe snakes with Erythrolanthus typhus, the velvet swamp snake, I think is the common name, and I love those things. They're beautiful. The bright green little Colubroid that you can keep in like a 20-gallon long. And unfortunately, they're not established in herpetoculture at all. And I just have been nabbing every one that I can get my hands on. And I get them established. They're doing great. And then I check on them one day and half of them have been dead. I have no idea why. They're eating. They put on mass, and that's just like you were talking about. That's the joy, if you will, of a challenging taxa. And that's the other reason why I like colubrids is they're just challenging. But at the same time, I keep king snakes because I got really tired of dealing with the challenges all the time. And within the past couple months, I kind of reevaluated what I have at my house, not necessarily here at the university, but I was like, I want something that's going to eat every time I offer a mouse. And if the heat lamp turns off, it's not going to be dead. And it's essentially bulletproof. So locality king snakes are something that I've gotten into and I'm really, really enjoying. And so that kind of biology ADD that I have, it just jives perfectly with colubrids. And then being the nerd that I am, I love evolutionary history and systematics and all that kind of stuff. And it's just really cool to have these different animals. And if you go past the paint job and actually learn about the biology and the evolution, it becomes really cool. Like just using North American colubrids, we've got pine snakes, Pichophis, the milk snakes, king snakes, Lampripeltis, and the rat snakes, Pantherophis. And these three different genera are very similar. They're all eating rodents or birds when they reach adulthood, but at the same time, they're very different evolutionarily. And that aspect of that of knowing that and keeping that and seeing that, I love it. And that's basically the main reason why I've gotten into the colubrids. And recently, just to talk a little bit about my collection, then we'll kind of bounce on to what your collection looks like. I think it was in April or May, I realized that I went down a rabbit hole I shouldn't have gone down, where I had some animals that I just kind of had them, and I didn't know why. Like they were there, and I bought them all the way back in 2016, 2017 when I was starting. And I don't know if it's because I thought they were trendy or I thought I should like them, but I kind of had this point where I picked up some Florida water snakes. They were given to me for free at the Columbus show. And I brought them home and I set them up in a naturalistic setup. I mean, these are, some people would consider these things cobra food. They're like literally $30, but at the show. But these things, they reminded me why I do this and why I like this and why I love this, because they utilize that enclosure. They bask like they would bask out in a swamp in Georgia. They were really responsive to me. Every time I would walk into the room, you'd see their little heads pop up. And I realized, like, I want to keep animals that are like that. I don't have hundreds of animals at home. I have, 40 to 60. And some of those animals are just an extension of the zoo science collection here, because we do a lot of the quarantine at my house just to get them completely out of this building in case there's something wrong with them. So my collection, as far as colubrids are concerned, it's these oddballs and it's things that I like. And right now it's those locality king snakes. It's these random South American dipsadids. And then I've just done a swan dive into the nature scene pool. I've gotten several different species and subspecies of garter snakes and Nerodia. And Nerodia are my favorite North American snake. I'm that guy. So the fact that I got them at home and they're raising, I produced Florida water snakes for the first time this year. And I will say one thing, we will talk about the benefits and the downfalls to naturalistic enclosures. When a broadbanded water snake has 30 babies in a naturalistic enclosure, you get to go herping in your office every night because they just basically dispersed into all the rocks and crevices and the cork tubes and the plants. It's like, geez, it took me like 3 weeks to get them all. So, yeah, that I get real excited when I talk about this stuff. In case you couldn't tell, but no, that's what my collection looks like. Now, my collection sits at about at home. I don't know the exact number. It's between 40 and 60. I'm actually downsized a bit, but your number's a little bit higher than mine.
It
So
is.
let's address that. So, what are
So,
you keeping, and what's your head count at?
well, sometimes I have to come back to real world and start to
Mhm,
think, wow, how do I balance time, life,
mhm,
and maintain a proper collection?
mhm.
Um, this year, just within the past couple of months, I've already hatched out, I want to say, probably 400 animals,
Yeah, that's
uh,
10
which
times
is
mine.
insane.
Mhm,
Um, and one of the challenges when you do large collections is making sure that you can properly balance it because you
mhm.
don't want to sacrifice quality.
Yep.
The aspect in terms of number of breeders that are here, it is right around 200 animals.
Okay.
And last year, I ended up because this is kind of the hard part in this hobby is maintaining and learning to hold back animals.
Yeah.
And last year I ended up holding back around 65 animals
Okay.
just because of the nature of the beast.
Mhm,
And with that being said, within the group here, that's just animals here and I plan to hold probably another 40 to 50 animals back this year.
oh my goodness.
But that being said, it is a heck of a lot better to do joint projects with people
Mhm.
because you never lose the animals, um, which is awesome being able to have friendships like that.
Yeah.
But within the group that is here, I work with a number of black rat snake morphs. Maggie has her
Mhm.
collection of corn snakes
Awesome.
of different scaleless, het scaleless, normals, oketees. Um, I am very passionate about file snakes, not
Yes.
only the forest files, but also the capensis, the
Mhm.
Cape file snakes. And those two species have been very important in my collection and something that I will never lose track of in this,
Nice.
just because we really don't know enough about those animals.
Mhm.
Natural history wise, anatomically, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And obviously, hunter flower rat snakes, Mandarin rat snakes, Chinese beauties, the red and black striped snakes, different Dions, not only locality, but also different morphs of those animals. All of the Porphyracea that are commonly kept
Yes.
in the hobby, which is also another one of those animals that will likely never leave from this
Mhm.
collection. Just because of the fact within the hobby, we've seen a lot of hobbyist Porphyracea pop up
Mhm.
and you can clearly identify those animals from the true subspecies of those. Uh, that also being said, rhino rat snakes, rain snakes. Um, I'm missing a ton of stuff. No, green bush rat snakes. Uh, outside of the pythons too. I mean, it's just you have to maintain a clean collection though. Like even
Mhm.
talking about quarantining. I think we even talked about the three-door rule of
Yep.
how do you maintain things of a nature in that aspect. So it's no easy task, especially feeding a bunch of babies because typically Maggie and Sydney will help me and we'll lay out deli
Mhm.
cups and defrost 300 to 400 pinkies and put a
That's
pinky in every
insane.
deli cup and then go across and put a baby snake in each one of them. But that's to monitor their growth, that's to monitor the feeding aspect of the animal and make sure that they are properly um, feeding and growing.
Yeah. And don't you have, I don't know if you said it or not, but don't you have a few mandarins?
I do. So
Mhm.
over the years, I've adjusted my collection of Mandarin rat snakes to not focus on the Chinese variety that are in the hobby, but to focus more on the Vietnamese locality
Yes.
animals, more specifically the Hong Valley Sapa. And The reason why I went down that road is we are starting to see a number of locality crosses of mandarin rat snakes too. We're starting to see some things that really doesn't naturally found in the locality of the animals. And but the reason why I went down the road of the Vietnamese is they do have the brightest coloration, but
Yeah,
they
they're
are
stunners,
also
man.
the largest.
Hmm.
Because I've shown pictures of 6 foot long mandarins. I've had mandarins coming out of tubs or cages chasing after rats and stuff like that. um, I may go down the road just because I don't see them very often anymore. I may go down the road of breeding Pityus mucosis again.
Oh, cool.
Um, yeah, because I did breed them for several years, and they're very prolific animals, laying 4 to 5 clutches a year, but we don't see them.
Yeah.
And part of the reason I moved away from them was not only time, but also space. I had some big males that were probably 6 or 7 feet long, and maybe even longer than that, and they were aggressive animals. And I kept my Pityus mucosis in communities of multiple males and multiple females,
Hmm.
which always made it very interesting when feeding time came too, because nothing more enjoyable than a Pityus chasing after you, growling
Yeah,
across the
that's
room.
pretty awesome.
So, sounds like might be a fitting animal for your
Hmm.
collection,
No,
though.
no, that's amazing to me. Yeah, that might have to enter the collection
Yeah.
because it growls. That's pretty awesome.
Well, and
So,
and that was part of the reason I pursued them too, is just because of their vocal cords, if you will,
hmm,
the way that they're able to expel air and push
yeah.
it through and mimic a cobra. Um, but maybe pursuing a couple of other projects here, some other things that aren't in the US hobby yet.
Oh, cool.
And so we'll see how those things kind of grow. I'm always looking for new challenges, obviously.
Hmm.
And when those opportunities present themselves, sometimes new species pop up that haven't been offered commonly in the hobby yet.
No,
So,
awesome. Yeah, I just kind of did my like blah thing that I do when I was talking about what I have. But right now at home, what I'm working with, I have quite a few of the false water cobras. I I did a head count, and then I did another head count. I was like, "There's no way." And then the third head count, I was like, "All right, that's happening. You might have a problem." But right now, I'm sitting at, I believe, it's at 6.8. So I have 14 of them, and those are big snakes. So I kind of keep the collection low because I found my animal. If and we all
yep.
have that one snake where we're like, this is it. And I was just fortunate enough to find it. So I have big enclosures. I have a wonderful wife who was like, all right, the garage, take it. So I keep most of my stuff. The falsies have to be in PVC enclosures. I'm not anti-rack, but for those animals, I am, because when they defecate, they defecate multiple times a week. And if you don't have good airflow and you pop open that drawer, I mean, just the ammonia cloud that hits you, you know that snake's not doing well living in that environment. Though I do know people that do keep them in extremely large tubs, the kind of tubs you would keep large bloods in, and they've adapted the tubs. But for me, it's PVC enclosures all the way. And then I have bear and eye, tricolor hognose snakes. I think I said that. Musaranas, Boruna, have some of those. And then some odds and ends. I've got the Kings. I've got Andean Milks because I just like them. They're cool. That's not something you see that often either. It took me forever to actually get my hands on them. I wish my male would grow a little bit more, because right now, if I put him in with the female, he's old enough, but he would be eaten. There's no way he would survive that. And then,
You're
like
not
I
going to
said,
take electrical tape and put it around the mouth like the old
yeah,
trick was?
I may. I'm afraid that the female that I have is ravenous. She comes launching out of the tub every time it's opened. Um, but anywho, and then I have some random North American rats. I bred for the first time this year Slowinski's rat snake. Used to be a species. Paper came out, made it a subspecies off of MRI. Tomato, depends on how you look at that whole deal. And then, like I said, hogs, obviously, Western hognose snakes. Took me forever to put together a group of normal Western hognose snakes. Turns out they're not normal because I bred them for a student project and we're popping out albinos left, right, and center. So even if it says normal, there's genes in there that aren't. That's okay. And then the nature scenes. We've got the banded water snakes, broad banded water snakes, Florida water snakes, the whole complex of Nerodia fasciata. And those are absolutely among my personal favorites.
No, I love when you post the pictures of them.
Yeah. Oh no, they're great. I mean, and they're as close to a snake dog next to the false water cobras as you can get. They're fantastic. And then with the garter snakes, that's kind of the new obsession. And I've been toying with the idea of jumping into Thamnophis. I've always liked Thamnophis. There's a big book that's been out forever on the garter snakes. That's what it's called. And, I've had that book since I was an undergrad, a decade. And I actually read it cover to cover when I was an undergrad. So garter snakes for me have just been something where I've been trying to keep it at bay. And now it's not at bay anymore. So I've recently picked up quite a few Oregon red spotted garter snakes. Those things are beautiful. Like, they're absolutely phenomenal animals. And then the Thamnophis equus complex out of Mexico. They're awesome. So they're big. It's basically if you took a North American water snake and then crammed it into a garter snake, you get these things, which are all members of the Thamnophis equus complex. So I've got quite a few of Thamnophis equus obscurus. I think it's Lake Chapala. I'm not good with the common names. And then I got another subspecies. I just have a pair of those, which is Thamnophis equus scotti. I think it's Scott's garter snake or something. I'm probably got the common name wrong there, but I mean, they're just a ton of fun. And then that's pretty much it. I get to live vicariously through my job. So I've got this massive collection at school. I just basically have the stuff at home to raise up, and everything that I have ultimately it shows up here at the university in some kid's project or something. I'm not, not crazy, though. Did produce about 100 false water cobras this year, which is kind of insane for a kid's thesis. And we're moving those out as we speak. So small but mighty versus giant. And then the way we keep, given the nature of our collection, that's another thing that makes us good for a podcast like this, because we both employ multiple husbandry strategies, and we both see the value in different husbandry strategies, which is something that I would like to preach a bit about. But my approach to things is I, here at the university and at home, the vast majority of animals are kept in PVC enclosures with mulch and hides and water. And that's just simply because we don't have the insane number of animals. But we do have racks. Like the tricolor hogs I keep are in racks. The Western hogs during the breeding season are in racks. The Lamprepeltis, when they're being reared up, are in racks. I have Oreocryptophis and Japanese rat snakes too. That's my. I had a huge Asian rat snake collection, and it kind of all got shifted to our good friend Justin Smith, who's inherited it. He said on a podcast, "I like Asian rats," and I was like, "All right, here you go." But I kept my Climacophora. The Jap rats are my personal favorite. I just love them to death. They're like the perfect size as far as I'm concerned. And then the Oreocryptophis, I like Pulcher. Which one? What's the common name for that one? I don't.
Union Mountain rat snake.
Union Mountain rat snakes. Yes. And I produced those for the first time this year, though I'm fairly positive I have contributed to the hobbyist Pulcher population because they came out of the egg and I was like, those are mostly Pulcher, but not quite. So their breeding days may be done after this year, but I can put them on my roster, check that, say I've bred them and move on to other things. But yeah, so that's my approach to keeping. But it's all based off what's best for the animal. And then there's also an aspect of the time I have, because I, like you, am an extremely busy guy. And that's part of the reason why I don't have monitors. If I had all the time in the world, I would have a giant monitor collection. I don't. So I don't have monitors. So the colubrids kind of lend themselves to, got to interact with them, but at the same time, 2 to 3 interactions a week for a short period of time is usually good enough to keep my collection, moving forward. So that's my strategy in keeping.
Well,
What's
to bring
yours?
up even like a funny story off of that, even today I was in the car with one of my customers and we were coming back from lunch and we started talking about different hobbies and things going on for the weekend. And I'm like, I told you I breed snakes, right? And the guy was like, bro, what? Bro.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, just go on YouTube, look up my name.
Mm-hmm.
He goes, bro, you said you have like snakes. He goes, I didn't know you have this like facility in your basement.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
um, but there are animals I keep in cages. I
Very
do have
cool.
animals in racks.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that has to do with the well-being of the animal,
Mm-hmm.
monitoring things as respected to that specific animal and adjusting accordingly. But one thing that we don't talk about in this hobby as much in terms of racks or caging is in my basement, I actually use UVB bulbs, but also full spectrum bulbs in the recessed lighting as well. And I
Yeah.
do have everything on light cycles too, as well.
Mm-hmm.
So something a little bit different instead of just putting things in racks and calling it a day. Having that full spectrum lighting as well as UVB, even in racks, you still have
Mm-hmm.
holes and you still are penetrating that cage accordingly. Um, Now, I take it a little bit different of an approach with using a rack, and I actually, even with, so I switched models of racks, and even with having holes on the top of the actual levels, I actually drill a number of holes throughout the actual tubs themselves, just to make sure that
Gotcha.
you're promoting airflow through it. Because one thing that we do see from people keeping racks is and I see it all the time posted on forums, and that aspect of it is my animal has a respiratory infection. Your animal doesn't have a respiratory infection. Your animal can't breathe in that tub more than
Yeah.
likely, or there's stagnant air, and now your animal has been breathing in mold and
Mm-hmm.
now is basically creating a bronchial infection in the animal. But even from a veterinarian care perspective, if that veterinarian isn't familiar with that, they might be treating it for symptoms of a respiratory infection and not actually treating the animal itself and continuously promoting the issue within the animal. So we'll never correct the issue itself. So there are ways and means to keeping animals successfully in racks. You have to be careful. You have to adjust. If anything, I think the priority or ease of a rack is to offer higher sanitation.
Yeah.
And I say that because it's a lot easier to clean a rack or a tub itself than it is to clean a full vivaria.
Yes.
Um, and,
I can speak to that.
yeah. Well, and it's funny too, because um, I mean, recently I was watching a podcast or YouTube video, something about it, and it was like a Q&A, and it was about natural vivaria and setting up flora inside of that. And in my mind, I'm thinking, how are you going to be able to keep up with that? Because you're going to have urates, you're going to have just feces, like no matter how many springtails, how
Mm-hmm.
many bugs you put in there, there's no way you're going to be able to keep up with that.
Oh, yeah.
Uh,
The guy who's the guru of bioactivity was just recently on a podcast, John Courtney Smith, and he was saying like the idea of bioactivity is wonderful, and it in herpetoculture, everybody kind of gravitated towards it, thinking it's now the gold standard, and that's what we have to do. And the guy that literally wrote the book on it was saying that it's great, but it doesn't necessarily, like, not everything should be kept this way, because it's very difficult to reach that balance that you're trying to achieve with bioactivity, and that maybe the gold standard you should like learn about the biology of the animal that you are keeping, and then maybe go for naturalistic uh, aspects, not naturalistic 100%, just naturalistic aspects. For instance, with the tricolor hognose snakes, those are burrowers. In the Chaco of South America, those guys are spending a lot of time underground. So when I keep those in a tub, which I have mine in a rack, do the same thing you did. Got holes drilled in them, got light going in there. But I give them about 2 inches of substrate in the tub, and they grow like weeds, and they're doing great. Now I know another individual, he has his set up in PVC enclosures with full spectrum lighting, and he talks about them basking. So that's where the fun part of herpetoculture comes into play, because I can do that way, he can do it that, his way, and then rather than flame each other, we just have a discussion and kind of figure out not necessarily the best way, but the way, if that makes, I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's kind of what I'm getting at. So,
well, there's obviously that balance,
yes,
right? You want to look at both sides of it, see what is advantageous, because from your standpoint of having the animal in the tub, they're likely getting more humidity, and being a burrower, they're going to strive for that humidity. In a cage, you're going to lose some of that balance within that. But it'd be interesting also to monitor growth rates, feeding behavior, looking at all of those, because that not only presents itself with the stress that the animal might actually be achieving or being exposed to, and how does that animal relate from one side to the other, because your animal being in a rack might not have that much stress, because most animals, reptiles especially, they're isolates. They're not living in, not all reptiles are living in large communities where they're not building that social bonds. So it does promote somewhat of a higher feeding response in some animals, and it could very well be that balance, because I mean, heck, even some keepers will black out a whole terraria on the outside but keep the animal in a glass cage too.
And then other species, you throw them in the rack, and it's just not gonna, you're denying them key aspects of their natural history, and like an arboreal taxa. If you keep spilotes in a rack forever, that's an animal that rarely is they're on the ground, but that's an animal that evolved to live up in the canopy, mid-story of the jungle. That's where you'll find them in Costa Rica and Suriname and places like that. And when you keep that thing in a rack for its entire existence, we got problems probably. But when you're starting the thing off, like we had a clutch hatch here in 2020, I believe it was, and they were the bitiest little bastards. they were sassy as hell, and if we would have kept those things in naturalistic from the very get-go, I don't think it would have been copacetic. It took them all a little while, but once they started eating, they were okay, but they were in their tubs. Then we moved them into the PVCs once they got to a certain size. So that's all the kind of stuff that we're going to be talking about.
Right.
Multiple strategies, not just one. So,
well, and everyone's going to have their different approach, and it really comes down to what's best for the animal.
Yeah. So another question for you, and I like this question. What do you think is a colubrid keeper challenge that colubrid keepers have that maybe other people that keep pythons, boas, monitors, geckos, is there a challenge specific to the colubrid keeper in your eyes? And if so, we'll be talking about that for the duration of this podcast and bringing these kind of points up. But what do you think is something that might be a little bit more unique to colubrid keepers versus other keepers?
So from that, I hear this very frequently from people that may have switched from pythons or boas, and that is death. A lot of people that have switched from taxas to colubrids will typically experience, from my perspective, or heard and talked to people, is a higher mortality rate. And I think part of that is not related to the taxa itself, but based upon the willingness to adapt and grow and learn from our skill sets. Those people that have commonly made that question or brought up that fact, most of them want to be educated. Most of them want to learn. They want to know where their faults are and where they can succeed going forward. A lot of things do relate back to husbandry, as they usually do. Talking about the false respiratory infection,
Yeah.
as noted, there's a balance in keeping porphyracia. Um, a lot of people can keep them, but a lot of people cannot breed them, which I find very interesting. I've
Hmm.
heard this from a number of people where, and even talking with a mutual friend, Rob Stone,
Yeah.
Rob has mentioned, a lot of people can keep them or they just die out of nowhere. And a lot of it has to do, I think, with the relevant aspect of talking about humidity versus moisture, because I've
Yep.
seen people pour water directly into a tub and you're going to build bacteria in that environment. Even talking about fluidity of air movement coming in and out of an enclosure, especially if you have high moisture or high humidity in a cage, you're going to prompt growth and bacteria growth, especially if there are new parasites being brought into
Yes.
collections. Um, I also think that there are some very scary aspects that are being promoted in the hobby right now that aren't openly talked about. Um, and quarantine procedures are very necessary because I've heard from a number of keepers that have lost half, if not their whole collection, because of the fact that they didn't quarantine properly.
Yeah.
And it's not just crypto, there are other things too. But I think some of those aspects is you have to have a willingness and ability to watch your animals and grow.
Yes.
Um, it's not just about keeping and breeding the animals. You have to understand that animal and watch and monitor things, which I think is a challenge for a lot of people that are moving into colubrids, especially from other taxa, just because there is a lot to learn. Um,
Definitely. One challenge that I have is the damn things are minuscule when they come out of an egg. Like, you have this dainty little thing, and there's, that's one of the reasons why false water cobras are among my favorite, because there's nothing dainty about them when they pop out of an egg. They're boa size, and they're, first meal is a fuzzy, maybe even a rat pink, but like the Palcher that hatched out, or that I have, or the Swinsky eye, or I even hatched out mad cats, Madagascar cat-eyed snakes.
Mhm.
They're just tiny, and it's difficult to get the tiny little thing to eat. It's also can be difficult to keep the tiny little thing in something because it's tiny. They're little escape artists. I bought a rack. I got a bunch of Mexican hognose snakes. Oh, I have those too. Uh, and I bought this rack, and I thought there's no way that they're going to be able to get out of that little 3 millimeter tall gap between the tub and the rack. And I put them in there, and I went downstairs. My son's bedroom is the quarantine, by the way. And I was watching TV with my wife, and I thought, why did you even think that they would stay in there? Like, go back up there. And sure enough, I went back up there, and I caught them before they were, ended up in the ether of the house. But there were three little Kennerly heads staring at me because they could just, they're just very good at getting out. That's something that I actually think is unique to us, is that these things, when they come out, are tiny, like those baby broad-banded water snakes all over that cage that had vents. Like I said, I have a very tolerant wife. We found two scuttling across the living room floor, which is right next to where my office, where the animals are. So that small size, and then you couple small size with pathogens and trying to rear these things. And then they got this surface to body ratio thing going on, where if you don't keep them wet enough or offer them enough moisture, they dehydrate and die. So, like, I think that establishing them once they hatch is even corn snakes can be a pain in the ass, and they're like a beginner snake. I know Joe Phelan, Captain Corn Snake, was giving away kits to families, and he talks about how he didn't like giving them away until they were like 6 months old, and they got past that stupid little baby phase that is unique to colubrids. And then another thing that I have is that The short tail pythons and the false water cobras living in my garage have completely different metabolisms. The 8-foot long falsie is going to lay 2 toddler sized dumps in the course of the week, and the short tails might go to the bathroom once every 2 months. Like, so it's just the maintenance aspect. These are not snakes that you can normally just kind of hit them all. If you have a large collection, I don't think it's possible to only check up on them once a week.
No.
You can't do
Yeah.
that. They're just going to be crapping everywhere, and you're going to be dealing with a fly outbreak, which the forward flies lead to the crypto spread. I mean, it's just like, so one of the things I like about them is that challenge associated with them, which is just everything about them is faster and a little bit more intense. Now, granted, they're not as intense as a 20-foot retic, but at the same time, I like the fact, I actually like the challenge associated with colubrids in that you kind of have to stay on it. That this isn't a group that you can just kind of arbitrarily have and it even get to a point of an afterthought. If you have a large collection, it's an afterthought, they're all dead.
Well,
That's
and
what's happening.
it's also interesting too, because with it, you have to keep an open mind
Mm-hmm.
too on top of it, because some of these animals don't start off on rodents.
No.
Um, some start off on crickets, some start off on fish, some start off
Geckos.
on geckos, anoles, frogs, other snakes. So with some of that, you really do have to be prepared and well versed on the animal's biology and natural history before you do proceed some of it. Because
Mm-hmm.
if you don't, you'll end up talking about death too as well.
Yes. Yeah. No, I that's definitely an aspect of it. And it does seem like the boa peeps have serpentivirus or nidovirus, whatever you want to call it. And we have that too. In colubrid world, that's absolutely something that's been identified in corn snakes. There's a strain that's colubrid specific. But as far as like the pathogens, and we seem to keep coming back to this topic tonight, but it's an aspect that people don't talk about it, and we're going to talk about it, which is there are these medical challenges associated with these snakes. After dealing with the crypto scare, it seems like once a year, either here at the university or at my house, everything will kind of systematically stop going off of food. And then I'll get one regurgitation and it's like full blown PTSD, like boom, oh God, what's going on? And then it's just because there was a cold front that moved through, or it was some little microclimate thing went through. That's a uniquely colubrid keeper thing because these things eat. They have fast metabolisms, and if you don't get them eating, it's not like you can wait for long periods of time. They're a group that, not that I'm promoting shoving a tube down their throat and pumping pinkies down in there, but if you go, for most colubroids and colubrids, if you go month and a half, 2 months without them eating, that's a problem. Whereas
Except for
with
Japanese forest rat snakes.
except for those guys. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing. There's exceptions to everything. But boid people go 2 months without a meeting. It's okay if it's established. If it's a neonate, that's a little different. But you know what I'm saying. So, anywho.
No, I mean it's just one of those things. I think it needs to be properly discussed. I think we'll learn a lot about a number of different species as we go through this too, and I hope it brings a lot of interest in terms of keeping some of these new species, because the only thing it can do is make us better keepers in the hobby.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I got, we asked each other to come up with a question that the other one didn't know was coming. Mine is a softball underhand pass kind of thing, but it isn't at the same time, which, it's one of those go down rabbit hole things. But do you have a favorite colubrid?
Whew.
Or colubroid?
So out of everything that I have, my favorite is the file snakes.
Really?
If I could keep one species only, it would be the file snakes.
I was not expecting. I thought it was going to be Porphyracia for cockeye
No,
for sure.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The files would be the number one. And the
Really?
reason
That's
why
cool.
is the females especially get to such a large size. We don't necessarily see those animals brought in as wild caught animals, and if they do, they don't last very long. But what I have found very interesting about that specific group is they never bite.
Really? Hmm.
Extremely docile, even when they're healthy animals. You, because if they were sick, they're really not going to try to do anything.
Mhm.
But they are very unique and very social when handling.
Interesting.
I think that's why we're starting to see a lot of people picking up more commonly wild caught animals, and there's been a lot of questions on that.
Mhm.
Um, but they are such an interesting animal because of their keeled scales, the
Mhm.
way that their head is actually structured. Um, they are rodent eaters. To be honest, I think they're just a very generic feeding animal.
That's pretty
Um,
badass.
so, because I've offered them pieces of tilapia,
Mhm.
chicken, just like stuff like from feeding crebos that I would have left over, and watching them, there is so much we can learn about them.
Mhm.
Um, and that to me is what makes them so interesting because for years they've always been identified as a garbage snake,
Mhm.
really. I mean, the only reason they're even or were exported from Africa is purely because of the fact that they were a byproduct of the ball python trade.
Mhm.
You've got to take 1,000 ball pythons and these 100 file snakes and this and that. Um, and they never did well in captivity, and I think it's awesome to see people gaining such an interest off of them because they do extremely well as captives. They grow very fast and they handle incredibly well. They don't run,
Huh.
squirm, run, um, and they have black musk, like jet black
Hot
musk.
damn. Okay.
like,
Wow.
like, you get
I've
musked
never
by one
seen
of them.
that.
Oh
Mhm.
man, and it smells like just burnt rubber.
Mhm.
Just like Mullendorf eyes is bright
Uh-huh.
red, and you can't get it off your hands. Anything
Ah,
makes it very interesting when you go to the grocery store after getting
yeah, I
musked.
gotcha.
Yeah.
So so I see them, everybody sees those things on social media and they end up in Instagram. And then we've got filters in Instagram so we can kind of tweak colors out. But I
Clickbait.
have are they as purple as they appear to be in those pictures? I saw some at a local show and they were imported, and I actually contemplated and I was like, yeah, they're a little bit too far gone. But there was definitely a purple hue there,
Hmm.
and I've ever since I saw those animals, I was like, well, if they were in captivity and they were born in human care and raised up, they don't have that unfortunate import look. I thought maybe, but I also thought we're definitely increasing the like hue a little bit on those pics. So what's the deal with that?
So the Cape Files definitely do have a nice purple undertone.
That's pretty awesome.
Um, the Cross Eye or Forest Files, I think that there's actually a couple of different localities that we're seeing.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
be- because I've had jet black ones, I've had gray ones, I've had purple ones. Um, not as purple as the capes themselves, but I do think we're seeing either some locality traits or population traits for that matter. I don't think they're two different species
Mm-hmm.
because often with the file snakes themselves, you'll see people advertising poensis and cross-eye,
Mm-hmm.
and what they really have is cross-eye. Um, because poensis have such a narrow head and they're elusive gecko eaters.
Oh,
Um,
gotcha.
I've had them; they're pain. I will never go down that road again.
Yes,
So,
stayed away.
um, but it's interesting because, like we were talking even too, I mean, I think we're going to learn a lot about different populations as well as, and that's the cool part about locality
Mm-hmm.
because the reality of it is locality information. The only value that even brings to this whole hobby is to be able to look up where those animals are found, look at weather patterns,
Yes.
rainfall, and learn how to cycle the animals properly. Saying that the animal is pure locality from this area, pure locality from this area, we're really taking word of mouth at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, we see it all the time in the king snake community, and it's interesting to me from looking at mandarin rat snakes, that a lot of people that were breeding them over the years are now, they went from just mandarin rat snakes to now having locality mandarins. So what happened in like that 10 years?
Yeah.
But they're the
No
same
clue.
animals.
Mm-hmm. No. Well, that's an aspect of Colubrid that I do like, because we do have several groups where locality is a thing. You know, the obvious kind of extreme to that would be gray bands, alterna, things like that. Where, as a biologist, I'll be the first one to admit, and I hope I'm not pissing in someone's Wheaties. Like, but when you have a road and one side of the road is one locality, and then the other side of the road, 15 feet, different locality. Yeah, I get it. The snakes may not cross the road that often, but all it takes is one animal to cross that road in a decade and get the genes from one side of the road to the other. It's all irrelevant. So anyway, but you can't have that, pretty phenotype, all that kind of good stuff. But no, the locality stuff, I love that stuff. It is difficult to isolate that down if you have an importation, though. I know with my Typhlis that I'm working with, it just says Suriname. And the reality of that is I was keying out one of the animals that I have, and there's 3 subspecies to Typhlis, and I was getting a result that was not the best, because the head scalation was indicative of an animal from Brazil, and we shouldn't be getting animals from Brazil. A totally different subspecies than what was in Suriname, but I don't know. I'm not a expert on those guys. I just wanted to know what the hell I had, because I didn't want to be breeding or attempting to breed one subspecies to another, and they weren't going to be copacetic, because they could very well be species. That's a group of snakes that's not really been studied to death. So, yeah, but no, the locality, you can go down rabbit holes real quick with that stuff.
Real quick.
It's pretty cool.
I mean, we had that discussion with Kevin and the rest of the group too, with Porphyracia. There's a lot to learn. There's
Tons
a lot
to learn.
We can value from it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the benefits of even getting wild caught animals, is learning some of that information.
Yep.
But so my question to you is, why the hell crayfish, man?
Okay. That's a great question. All right. I can answer this question. There's probably quite a few people that are like, yeah, why the hell crayfish? It actually is my advisor at Marshall, who was basically like a second grandfather to me, Dr. Pauly, for anybody who knows him, he's a salamander biologist. So I'm not a snake guy, but definitely he's well known in the salamander world. I was in grad school in 2003 through 2005 at Marshall. And when I was there, I had like the dream position in the lab, which was I had a research assistantship. I didn't have a teaching assistantship. And I was essentially Polly's grunt. So he had some grants that weren't affiliated with anyone's student, and it was my job to run those grants. In fact, one of them on salamanders should have probably been my thesis, but I was dumb and stubborn and was like, I'm going to do the hognose snake. And we all know how that turned out. But I had this project where I had to, there were 2 key events that happened. The first event was we were studying ambistomatid salamanders, so mole salamanders. And we were trying to find one that is really common actually in Indiana, in Kentucky and places like that, but it's super rare in West Virginia. It's a smallmouth salamander, Ambystoma texanum. And this animal comes out in February and early March when there's like snow on the ground still, and it goes into vernal pools, and it basically, it breeds and then goes back to crayfish burrows, root cavities, all that kind of stuff. And then you don't see them again for the rest of the year. So you got this really narrow window of time to catch them. And so my job was to set minnow traps from Huntington, West Virginia, which is all the way down on the West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio border, all the way up here to where I live in the northern panhandle between Pennsylvania and Ohio, the entire Ohio River floodplain, and basically determine where the salamanders were and then the density of the salamanders. And so I had over 200 minnow traps in vernal pools from one part of the state to the other. And I was basically going every weekend or every other weekend and driving from Huntington to home. It was real convenient because I could just drive to my parents' house and then spend the night and then drive back down and hit half of the trap lines on the way up and half the trap lines on the way down. And you get bycatch. So I was getting spotted salamanders, leopard frogs, which were rare in West Virginia, pickerel frogs, wood frogs, all kinds of things. And I kept getting these crayfish. And I knew, I looked at the crawdads and they were totally different than any crayfish that I'd ever caught before. They didn't look like the crayfish in a creek. They didn't look like the crayfish that are in the little streams where we were catching salamanders. And they were just pugnacious as hell. And a common theme to Zach Loafman liking animals is if it wants to kill me, I love it. And the fact that these little things were scrappy and they actually gurgled, they made noises when I pulled them out of the bucket. And I just found them to be incredibly endearing little things. But I'm going to grad school for herpetology. So, I can't possibly like crayfish. And at the same time, another one of the graduate students had a thesis where they had set up what's called a drift fence around a pond that had a really rare salamander in it. And what ended up happening was there was a big rain event and the salamanders moved to the ponds and these crayfish moved to the ponds at the same time. And salamanders plus crayfish in a bucket equals salamander pate. And so my fellow grad student came into the lab one infamous morning and she had a 5-gallon bucket and the lid was like pounded down on top of it. And she came in and she basically slammed this bucket down on my desk. And my job in the lab, I love to identify any animal. Doesn't matter what it is. Like I went through a leech phase where I was identifying leeches just because nobody could. So I love keying things out. I love getting in the old field guide. Like that's my bread and butter. And she slammed this bucket down and she said like, what the F are these effing things? And then stormed out. And, I'm hearing like this noise in the bucket. I'm like, what the hell's in the bucket? I don't know what's in the bucket. So I, open up the bucket and there's 50 of these same crayfish that I'd been finding up along the Ohio River. And they all, rear their claws up or keely up. And I was like, all right, I got to figure what the hell these things are. So that's all happening. At the same time, my advisor sat down with me and we actually drove from the New River back to Marshall. And at that point in time, the timing is very important because this is the early 2000s. This is when Jeff Corwin, Steve Irwin, Mark O'Shea, everybody's on Animal Planet and reptiles are hot. Like they had infiltrated pop culture. There were all kinds of people that were actually going to school to be herpetologists. Herpetologists that was not a common job back in the day. And everybody in the early 2000s, it was actually, that's when it wasn't like you weren't the outcast if you wanted to be a herpetologist. It was something that people wanted to be. And my advisor we were talking and he said to me like, Zach, I know you love your herps, but I've been watching you and you just nerd out over everything. It doesn't matter what the hell it is. If it's creepy, crawly, if it doesn't have fur, it doesn't have feathers, you're going to enjoy it. So keep the herps as your like hobby avocation, or sorry, not avocation, but like something you're interested in, but find a group of animals where there aren't that many people that study them and you can still nerd out and have, the best time ever. And so while this crayfish thing's happening kind of on the side, I'm trying to find another organismal group so that I can like have a paycheck and feed my family when I get done with all this graduate school. And because at the other thing that kind of made me jump from herpetology to crayfishes was there was a job that opened up in Pennsylvania. And it was to study Massasauga rattlesnakes, and it was a tech position. And it was only for 6 months. And I thought, I looked at it and I think it was for like 10 grand or something. And I applied and I contacted the people that had the job and I was talking with them. I got to know them. And I said, so how many people applied for that job? And they're like, oh, we have about 300 applicants and about 40 PhDs. And I was like, how the hell am I going to get a job as a herpetologist if there's 30 freaking PhDs applying for this position? So I dabbled with the crayfish. And then as time went on at Marshall, I started finding out that I was spending way more time reading about the crayfish and nerding out about the crayfish. And I kind of took it upon myself. There was a book called The Crayfish of West Virginia. And I took it and went out across the state when I would do my herping stuff for Polly. And I found myself like, oh, there's a creek I haven't gone to. So I would, go look for whatever frog or salamander he sent me out to see or find. But then I was in the river on the way home, finding the crawdads, adding those to my life list. So it also was very lucrative for me because crawdads are about the same size as a frog or salamander. And all the methods I had learned to study the ecology of frogs and salamanders were directly applicable to crayfish. And when I was looking at what people had done scientifically, nobody really studied the natural history and ecology of crayfishes. What people did is they used them as a model organism in a stream ecosystem, but nobody really studied them for them. And my jam, my bag is natural history. I like to figure out the who, what, when, where, why of an animal. My hero scientifically is a herpetologist that was at the University of Kansas. His name was Dr. Fitch, Henry S. Fitch. I love his studies. And I thought, well, hell, Fitch did all this stuff for snakes. No one's done this approach for crayfishes. It's known as otacology. So why don't I just do that? And it was the best decision I ever could have made, because now I'm here at West Liberty. I've got a crayfish conservation lab that has I don't even know how many grad students. I think we're pushing 10, if not 10 graduate students in the lab. I've got tons of funding. And I've been able to make a name for myself, and there really wasn't much competition. If I would try to do the exact same thing in herpetology, it's like cutthroat. You have to be aggressive. I'm not saying that herpetologists don't get along. They're great, wonderful people. But it's just a totally different vibe. I could not do what I do as a conservation biologist at West Liberty if I studied snakes.
You've been hanging out with too many ichthyologists, man.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, fish people and we get along. But I can say that in the aquatic ecology world, crayfish biologists are the redhead stepchildren. Like, there's literally none of us. When I am the youngest, I'm trying to think of the people I work with, and we all get along. That's the other thing about crayfishes. There were some aspects when I was in the herpetology world where people were kind of ego matters. And I don't like that. That's not me. And in the crayfish world, you are like an uber nerd if you're going to dedicate your life to a freaking crustacean. So you have no ego. And we all just kind of get along. And like I said, I think there's like maybe a dozen people in the US. We had the International Asticology. That's the science of crayfish. Because Asticus is the genus of crayfishes in Europe. We had the International Asticology Association meeting in Pittsburgh. And this is the entire world. That meeting for herpetology has hundreds of people at it. This meeting, we didn't breach 100. On 7 billion people, there's not 100 people that go to this meeting. That's how small this field is. And I absolutely love it, though, because it's a super tight-knit community. We all get along. We all collaborate. So, yeah, that's why crayfish. And crayfishes and herps are linked. Like, burrowing crayfishes create habitat that's utilized by mastosagas, crawfish frogs.
Thamnophis.
You don't have those. Yeah, Clenophis, Kirtlandii, the Kirtland snake. You don't have those animals without crayfish. So I can kind of have my cake and eat it too, because I've got a whole subset of research that we're doing here at the university. It has nothing to do with herpetoculture. It's natural history for the sake of natural history. But one of the research angles that I like is crayfish herp interaction. So we've been studying queen snakes, Regina septemvitata. This is an animal that's a dietary specialist on not just crayfish, but softshell crayfish. Less than a mile from where I'm sitting, we have a thriving population of Regina. So, I've been studying those with undergrads, and now I've had one graduate student do a thesis on them. I have a new incoming student that's we're actually going to be getting radio transmitters and tracking them and really kind of diving into their ecology. So crayfish enable me to jump back into herpetology, which is, pretty damn awesome. So that's why crayfish. And then I guess the final thing is, I never thought that I would name new species. Like, that was not something I thought I would do. Because there's so few people studying crawdads, one of the biggest problems I run into is I'll go into a stream in like Tennessee and I'll be sampling the animals and they don't have freaking names. Do you know how hard it is to explain to somebody what something's doing if it doesn't have a name? So, I was kind of thrown in the deep end of systematics and had to learn evolution and taxonomy and the process of naming things, and then genetics. I'm a field guy. I am not a bench guy. but to name these taxa, I had to learn phylogenetics. So, when new species descriptions come out for snakes, I'm due to the fact I'm doing this stuff with crawdads, I can read the snake description and kind of figure out the validity or lack thereof. And I will say one thing, the crayfish taxonomists of the world, we sure do have larger sample sizes than those snake people. I name a new species and I looked at like 60 to 90 specimens if I can. There's snake taxa being described recently based off of a sample size of 6 animals. Yeah, but don't get me started on that rant. So, yeah, you asked a question. You asked a question at the end that could have added 45 minutes of this thing. So, yeah. But no, that is the.
Well, I think at some point it
answer.
might even be interesting to even go down the road of
we will
higher education even too.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
I'm sure we have some younger viewers that will be interested in how do you pursue this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially since you and I, we both went down this different ways.
Now, there's more than one way to skin this cat. So that is for sure. Okay. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. How about you? We good?
I think so. I mean, if you listen to this whole thing, obviously write us an email.
Yes. Yeah. So this is our first time signing off, and in future episodes, it'll be more polished. But we're going to give it a go. So thank you if you made it to this point. Can't wait to do more episodes with Colubrid and Colubroid Radio. We are part of the Morelia Python Network, and I don't even know how many podcasts there are now. But if you found us, you almost certainly found them. And in the future, we'll be listing off all of those podcasts as well. And yeah, that's all I have. You have anything else, Matt?
No, I think this was a lot of fun, guys. And we hope you enjoy our evolution in this podcasting realm here.
Yes. So thank you all and have a great day. Later.